The bicycle was still lying on its side in the driveway when I pulled up. That's the image that stays with me. Not what happened inside. Not the phone call I made afterward. Just that bicycle my grandson Luca's birthday present from 3 months earlier tipped over in the gravel with one pedal still spinning slowly in the wind. I sat in my car for a moment before I got out. I'm 63 years old. I've learned that when your chest is tight and your jaw is clenched and your hands are gripping a steering wheel harder than they need to be, you sit for a moment. You breathe. You think about what you're going to do before you do it. Then you get out of the car. My son Joel is 34. He's a good man. I want to say that plainly, because what I'm about to tell you might make him sound weak. And he isn't. He's kind and he works hard and he loves his children more than anything in this world. But Joel married a woman whose father believed that kindness was the same thing as weakness. And for a long time, longer than I like to admit, my son started to believe it too. His wife's name is Simone. She's not a bad person. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I keep arriving at the same place. She's not bad. She loves Joel in her way, and she loves their children. But she grew up watching her father handle every difficult situation with force and volume and the absolute certainty that he was always right. And somewhere along the way, she came to mistake that for strength. Her father's name is Noel Kavanagh. He's 58. Retired early from something in construction management. Big man, broad shoulders. The kind of laugh that fills a room whether the room wants it to or not. He lives in Tauranga with Simone's mother, Glenda. And they drive down to Wellington to visit 3 or 4 times a year. Each visit is a performance. Noel always arrives with wine he's very proud of, and opinions he's even prouder of. And within about 40 minutes of being in the house, you can feel the air change. Joel would never say anything critical about Noel to me. He'd been careful about that since the beginning. But I'm his father. I've known him since, before he knew how to speak. I could see it every time the visits ended, the way Joel's shoulders dropped, the way he got quieter for a day or two afterward. Small things. But I noticed. The situation that changed everything started with something that shouldn't have mattered at all. Joel and Simone had been talking about buying a section in Kapiti. They'd found something they liked and they were trying to pull together enough for the deposit. I'd offered to help, not a lot, but something, and Joel had thanked me and said he'd let me know. That was in April. By July, apparently Noel had decided to get involved. I heard about this secondhand, from Joel in pieces, over several weeks. The short version is that Noel had strong views about which bank they should use, which mortgage broker was best, and which suburb they should be looking in instead of the one they'd chosen. When Joel pushed back gently, the way Joel always does things, Noel told him he didn't know what he was talking about. He means well, Joel told me on the phone one evening. He's just got a strong personality. I said. I've learned when not to push, but it kept building. Noel started turning up at the house unannounced on weekends. He'd take over conversations at dinner. He'd make comments about Joel's job. Joel's in logistics, has been for 8 years, does well with this tone that suggested it wasn't quite the right kind of job. Not serious enough, not ambitious enough. Simone never challenged him. That was the hard part for Joel, I think. He could have tolerated Noel if Simone had just once said, "Dad, that's enough." But she didn't. She'd laugh a little, or change the subject, or say, "Oh, you know what Dad's like." The children, Luca is 7, and his younger sister, Ava, is 4, adored their grandpa Noel. Kids often adore the loudest person in the room. He brought them things and told them big stories and swung them around. That's not nothing. But I also watched how Joel looked when Noel was performing for the kids, doing the big grandfather act, and there was something behind my son's eyes that I didn't like. He was disappearing. Slowly. But he was. The Saturday it happened was the second weekend of August. I know the date because I'd marked it in my calendar, Joel and Simone's end-of-winter barbecue, the one they do every year for both families and a few friends from the street. I'd driven up from Lower Hutt that morning. It was one of those Wellington days that can't quite decide whether to be winter or spring cold in the shade. Warm enough in the sun if you found the right spot. Noel and Glenda had arrived before me. Noel was already holding court near the gas heater on the deck when I got there, telling someone a story about a fishing trip. Glenda smiled at me warmly. She's always been kind to me. I think she sees more than she lets on. The afternoon was fine at first. The kids were running around. Joel was at the barbecue. Simone was inside with a couple of friends. I had a beer and talked to one of the neighbors about the All Blacks. Normal Saturday. Then Luca did something that 7-year-olds do a dozen times a day. He ran through the back door without taking his shoes off, and he tracked mud across the kitchen floor. Simone said something to him, not harshly, just Luca, shoes off at the door. Mate and Luca said okay, and went to take them off. It was done. It was a non-event, but Noel had seen it from the deck. He came inside, and he spoke to Luca, in a voice I hadn't heard him use with the children before. Low. Pointed. He told Luca that when his mother said something, he listened immediately. Not when he felt like it. And while he was saying this, he reached out and gripped Luca's upper arm, tightly, and pushed him, not a shove exactly, but something between a correction and a push toward the door. Luca stumbled. He didn't fall, but he stumbled, and his face went white, and then he started to cry. Simone said, "Dad," and stopped. Noel said, "He's fine. Boys need to learn." I was standing in the hallway. I had seen the whole thing. I looked at Joel. Joel was looking at Luca. Then he looked at Noel. Then, and this is the part I can't quite forgive, not because Joel is a coward, but because I know how long Noel had been grinding him down. Joel looked at the floor. Noel said, "Don't cry. It was nothing." Then he walked back out to the deck. I went to Luca. I crouched down and I said, quietly, "Come with Granddad, mate. Come on." I took him outside through the side gate, and we sat on the front step, and I let him calm down. He leaned against my arm, and I put my hand on his head, and I didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then I told him he'd done nothing wrong. I told him Granddad was here. I told him he was safe. Then I went back inside. Joel was in the kitchen, alone. The guests had drifted back outside. He was standing at the bench, not doing anything, just standing there with his hands flat on the counter. I said, "Joel." He said, "Dad, I know. That's not going to happen again." He closed his eyes. "Dad, please, don't make this worse." "I'm not going to make anything worse. I just need you to hear me. That is not going to happen again." I squeezed his shoulder. He nodded. Then I went out to my car, and I made a phone call. The person I called was Marcus Taine. He's been my closest friend for 31 years. We met in our early 30s when we were both doing adult night classes, him in accounting, me finishing my law degree part-time while I was working at the firm. Yes, I'm a solicitor. I've been practicing for 28 years, the last 18 as a partner at a firm in the CBD that handles civil litigation, family law, and estates. I don't talk about it unless someone asks, and I don't bring it to family gatherings. My work is my work. Joel has never been especially interested in what I do day to day. He knows I'm a lawyer in the broad sense, but the details have never come up much, and I've never pushed them. Some people think that's strange, but I grew up with a father who never stopped talking about his job. And I decided early on that I wasn't going to be that at the dinner table. Marcus picked up on the second ring. I told him what I'd seen. I was calm. I've learned to be calm when I need to be. I told him I needed his advice as a friend, not professionally. And then I told him what I was actually thinking about doing. And he said, "You know you don't need my advice. You already know what you're doing." He was right. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. Then I went back inside, and I stayed for another 2 hours, and I helped Joel clean up, and I said goodbye to the kids, and I drove home to Lower Hutt. The next morning I started making notes. In New Zealand, physical discipline of children by non-parents is not a gray area. It hasn't been since 2007. Section 59 of the Crimes Act was amended specifically to remove the defense of reasonable force in the physical correction of a child. What Noel had done gripping a 7-year-old hard enough to cause him to stumble, with intent to correct behavior, met the threshold for assault under the Act. I'm not going to pretend it's the most serious case I've ever seen. It isn't. But the law is the law. Because it is consistent, not because it is convenient. And more than the legal question, there was the practical one. Luca needed to know that what happened to him was not acceptable, and Joel needed to see that someone would act on that belief. I spent the following week being careful. I rang Joel on the Wednesday, just to check in. Normal conversation. He mentioned that Noel had apparently apologized to Simone for the disruption, which is quite a different thing from apologizing to Luca or to Joel. I noted that. I contacted a colleague of mine, a woman named Petra, who does child and family law and who I've worked alongside for 15 years. I explained the situation in general terms, without naming anyone, and asked her to confirm my reading of the relevant provisions. She confirmed it and then said, "Are you involved in this personally, Terence?" I said yes. She said, "Do you want me to handle it?" I said I'd let her know. I also rang my contact at the Wellington district, someone I've dealt with professionally over the years, and I asked a few quiet questions about process and how an initial report would be handled. Not threatening, just information. Then I rang Marcus again, and we had a long conversation about what I actually wanted out of this. Not legally, personally. What outcome was I looking for? That question mattered more than any of the legal ones. What I wanted was simple. I wanted Noel Kavanagh to understand, in a way he could not dismiss or talk his way around, that he had crossed a line with my grandson and that it would not happen again. I wanted Joel to see that his father was capable of standing between his family and something harmful. And I wanted Luca to grow up knowing that adults who are responsible for him take that responsibility seriously. None of that required a conviction. But it required something real. I drove to Tauranga on a Thursday. I didn't tell Joel. I didn't tell Simone. I rang Glenda the day before, and I said I needed to speak with her and Noel together about something important regarding the family. She heard something in my voice. I think she'd been waiting for a call like this, honestly, and she said, "Come Thursday afternoon. I'll make sure he's here." Noel opened the door in a polo shirt and bare feet, holding a mug. He looked surprised but not alarmed. He said, "Terence, didn't know you were coming up." I said, "No. I thought it was better to come in person." We sat at their kitchen table. Glenda made tea she didn't drink. Noel leaned back in his chair the way he always does. Comfortable, occupying space. I put a folder on the table. I'm a solicitor. I understand the effect of a folder placed on a table. I said, "I want to talk about what happened at Joel and Simone's house 3 weeks ago." Noel's expression shifted slightly. "The thing with Luca? Terence, that was nothing. The boy needed." "Noel." I kept my voice level. "I'm going to ask you to let me finish." He closed his mouth. I explained, clearly and without drama, what I had witnessed. I described it in factual terms. Then I opened the folder. It contained a printed summary of the relevant sections of the Crimes Act, a printed copy of the 2007 amendment, and a one-page letter I had written on firm letterhead, signed by me, addressed to Noel specifically. The letter stated what I had observed, identified the legal provisions I believed were engaged, and stated my intentions if the matter was not resolved to my satisfaction. Noel stared at the letterhead. He's an intelligent man in many ways. He understood immediately what he was looking at. He said, "You're a lawyer." I said, "I have been for 28 years, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Joel knows you're here?" "No." "Simone?" "No." He looked at Glenda. Glenda was looking at her hands. I said, "I'm not here to cause damage to your family or mine. I'm here because my grandson was physically handled by an adult who had no right to touch him. And I witnessed it. And I have a professional and personal obligation to make sure it doesn't happen again." I paused. "The letter outlines 3 things I'm asking for. The first is a direct and genuine apology to Luca, delivered in person, in language a 7-year-old can understand. The second is a written acknowledgement, witness that you understand the legal position regarding physical discipline of children in New Zealand. The third is a conversation between you, me, Joel, and Simone, facilitated by a family mediator, before your next visit to Wellington." Noel said, "You've got to be joking." I said, "I don't joke about my grandchildren." He started to say something else. I could see it coming, the familiar building up of volume and certainty, and then he looked at the letterhead again, and he stopped. There was a very long silence. Glenda said, quietly, "Noel." He didn't say anything. I said, "I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to end your relationship with Joel's family. I'm not trying to keep you from seeing Luca and Ava. Those would be bad outcomes for everyone, including those children who love you. What I am doing is drawing a line that I should have drawn more clearly a long time ago, and asking you to stand on the right side of it." He looked up at me then. The performance had gone. Under it, and this surprised me a little, because I'd never seen it in him before, there was something that looked tired. He said, "I didn't mean to frighten the boy." I said, "I know. But you did." We talked for another 90 minutes. It wasn't easy. Noel is a man who has operated without significant pushback for a very long time, and sitting in the receiving end of a calm, documented, legally informed conversation was not something he had experienced before. There were moments when the old defensiveness rose up, when he tried to reframe what happened, when he suggested I was overreacting, when he made a comment about lawyers seeing everything as a problem to be sued. Each time, I waited. Then I said something like, "That may be how it feels from where you're sitting. Here's what I observed." And I'd return to the facts. Glenda spoke more than I expected her to. She said at one point, quite plainly, that she had been uncomfortable with some of the things Noel said to Joel over the years, and she'd never said so, and she was sorry for that. Noel looked at her with an expression I couldn't quite read, not angry, but something like recalibration. By the end of it, Noel agreed to all 3 things in my letter. He didn't do it gracefully. There was no moment of dramatic transformation or tearful apology at the table. He read the written acknowledgement I'd brought. Petra had drafted it, and he signed it with the air of a man who was doing something he didn't want to do and knew he had no good reason not to, but he signed it. I drove back to Wellington the next morning. I rang Marcus from the road. He asked how it went. I said, "About as expected." He said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. "I feel like I should have done something similar about 5 years ago." "You didn't know 5 years ago?" "No, but I suspected. And I let it go because it was complicated, and it wasn't my house, and Joel didn't ask me to." I was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing I'm sitting with." Marcus said, "You did it when it mattered." "I know. Then sit with that instead." I told Joel the following Saturday. I drove up and I asked if we could talk, just the 2 of us, and we walked down to the reserve at the end of his street, and I told him what I'd done. He didn't say anything for a long time. We walked a full lap of the reserve before he spoke. He said, "Why didn't you tell me first?" I said, Because I thought if I told you first, you might have asked me not to go. He said, I probably would have. I said, I know. He stopped walking. He looked at me, and I couldn't tell if he was angry or relieved, or both, because I think it was both. He said, he called Simone, you know, the night after you were there. He told her he'd had a conversation with me. He paused. He didn't mention you at all. I hadn't expected that. What did Simone say? Joel half smiled. She was confused, because when she asked me about it, I had no idea what she was talking about. He looked at the grass. She rang him back, and he told her the truth. That it was you. How did she react? He was quiet for a moment. She cried. Not because she was angry at you, I don't think. More because she hadn't known it was that serious. She hadn't seen it the way you'd seen it. I didn't say anything, Joel said. Dad, did you always know that he was? That he'd get to this point? I suspected he had a pattern that would eventually cause harm, yes. And you didn't say anything to me. No. It wasn't my place. Until it was. He nodded slowly. Then he said, what did you mean in the letter? The bit about drawing a line you should have drawn more clearly before. I said, I meant that I could see what was happening to you. And I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. And I was wrong about that. You're my son. It is always my business when something is diminishing you. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. He stood there for a while. Then he put his arm around me, briefly, the way he's done since he was a teenager, sideways. One arm, quick. And we walked back to the house. The mediation happened 6 weeks later. Petra recommended a mediator she'd worked with before, a woman who runs a practice in Thorndon. The four of them, Noel, Glenda, Joel, Simone, met for 2 sessions. I wasn't there. That wasn't my role. My role had been what it had been, and now it belonged to them. Joel rang me after the 2nd session. He said it had been uncomfortable and useful, and that Noel had said things he'd never expected to hear him say. I asked if Luca had gotten his apology. Joel said, yes. Noel came over last week. He sat down with Luca on the couch, and he told him that what he did was wrong, and that he shouldn't have touched him, and that he was sorry. Joel paused. Luca said, okay, and then asked if Grandpa Noel wanted to see his Lego. So, I laughed. I think it was the first time I'd properly laughed in about 2 months. Luca is doing fine. He doesn't talk about the incident, and I don't raise it with him. Kids are extraordinarily good at moving forward when adults create the conditions for it. Ava is still 4. She's fine too. She's always fine. That child was born with an unshakable sense of self that I can only aspire to. Noel and Glenda came down for Christmas. I was there. It was the first time I'd seen Noel since Tauranga. He shook my hand when he arrived, properly, and he held it a moment longer than a normal handshake. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. We didn't need to. He was different at Christmas. Quieter. Not diminished. Exactly more like a man who has recalibrated his understanding of a room he thought he knew well. He still told his stories. He still brought wine he was proud of, but he listened more than he used to. And he asked Joel questions about his work that were interested, rather than evaluative. And at one point I saw him crouch down next to Luca and help him with something on his plate without any commentary whatsoever. Small things. But I noticed. I've been a solicitor for 28 years. I've sat across tables from people who believed their position, their wealth, or their personality placed them beyond the ordinary requirements of decency and law. I've watched people protect harmful patterns in their families for years because naming those patterns felt like an act of destruction when really it was the first act of repair. I am not someone who believes the law solves everything. It doesn't. It can compel behavior. It can establish consequences. It cannot make a person understand why what they did was wrong, or feel genuine regret, or choose to be different. Those things happen somewhere else. In conversations like the one Noel and Joel eventually had in a mediator's office in Thorndon. But sometimes the law or the credible, documented, impossible to dismiss threat of it creates the conditions in which those conversations can happen. Sometimes a folder on a table is the thing that makes a difficult man sit still long enough to hear something he needs to hear. My grandson's bicycle is in the garage now. He's moved on to wanting a skateboard, which I have complicated feelings about, but I've already looked a few up. If there is something I'd want anyone to take from this, it's not about law or leverage or knowing the right people. It's simpler than that. When someone you love is being diminished, and you can see it clearly, and they can't quite see it themselves yet, that's not the moment to look at the floor. That's the moment to act, thoughtfully and without cruelty, but firmly. Protecting the people we love is not interference. It is the whole point. The other thing is this. The most dangerous thing about people who use control and force is not the individual incidents. It is the accumulation, the slow, patient erosion of a person's sense of what they deserve. Joel was a long way down that path by the time I showed up. I'm grateful I showed up when I did. I'm more grateful every time I think about how much further it might have gone. Be the person who shows up. Don't wait until you're sure. You'll never be sure. Act when it matters. With care and with everything you know. That's what I've got. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any abstract, philosophical way, just in the plain, practical sense of watching how things unfold when people are never held accountable for what they do. Noel didn't grab my grandson Luca because he was a cruel man by nature. I don't believe that. He did it because he had spent 58 years learning that his size and his volume and his certainty were enough to make other people back down. Every time someone looked at the floor instead of looking back at him, that lesson got reinforced. Joel looked at the floor 100 times. Simone never once said, "Dad, stop." Glenda went quiet. And so Noel kept going, kept expanding, kept filling whatever space was available to him until one Saturday afternoon in August, he reached out and grabbed a 7-year-old boy and pushed him, and he genuinely believed that was acceptable. That's what unchecked behavior does. It doesn't stay the same size. It grows. I'm not a perfect man, and I wasn't a perfect father. There were moments over the years when I saw what was happening to Joel in that marriage, the slow erosion of his confidence, the way he'd shrink a little in his own home when Noel was there. And I told myself it wasn't my place to step in. I told myself Joel was an adult. I told myself Simone loved him. And Noel meant well. And families are complicated. And who was I to interfere? All of that was true. And all of it was also a way of avoiding something uncomfortable. The thing I've come to understand, at 63, is that wisdom isn't just about knowing what's right. Most people know what's right. It's about having the courage to act on it when acting is hard. When the outcome is uncertain, when the people you love might be upset with you for getting involved. That's where character actually lives. Not in the easy moments, but in the ones where doing nothing is the more comfortable choice. What I did when I sat down at Noel's kitchen table with that folder wasn't revenge. It wasn't even really about winning. It was about refusing to let something harmful continue simply because naming it was inconvenient. It was about showing Joel, without saying it directly, that he was worth defending, that his children were worth defending, that there is always something you can do if you're willing to be the person who does it. The moral weight of that moment didn't come from the law. It came from deciding, finally, not to look away. Luca is 7. He'll probably forget most of the details of what happened that afternoon. But I hope somewhere underneath the forgetting, he carries the knowledge that when someone treated him badly, the adults in his life did something about it. That's the foundation. That's what lets children grow up trusting that the world has some structural integrity to it. And for Joel, I hope what he carries is the understanding that being a good man doesn't mean absorbing harm quietly. Strength isn't silence. It isn't endurance without limit. Real strength is knowing when to act, and then doing it thoughtfully, with everything you've got. I'm still learning that myself. I'm 63, and I'm still learning. But I'm learning.